Well, good morning, ladies and gentlemen. We'll get this session started. So, thank you very much indeed for hanging on to this point of the day. Really good to see quite a good an attendance here today. So, my name is Barry Lewis. I'm the leader of Derbyshire County Council and vice chairman of the network. This session is ambitiously titled "How to Reform Local Government Finance." In common with many local authorities right across the country, our local authority is no different in the sense that we're facing some particular financial struggles over the course of last year, this year and next year as well, projected. And I know many other local authorities are facing a very significant impact on their finances as well. So we're all under strain. We're waiting for a sense of direction from the government over the shape of the local finance settlement and what period of time that's going to be on, and that is going to follow on quite soon, we understand. So we're keen to understand as members what the likely impact of the budget and the spending review could be on council finance, and what the opportunities are as well for government to make progress on unfinished business around the fair funding review and the business rate and council tax reform as well. Many other big questions are roaming around that we've unpacked over the course of the last couple of days around devolution and what that white paper might bring, the sort of detail that sits behind public sector reform as part of that, the question marks that remain around local government reform and how that might work, the impact of those spending decisions on rural counties as well, and we've already heard about the social care 1.3 million and how that's going to be divvied up as well, and the implications for national insurance increases on service providers that we all buy into, particularly across social care and so on. So there's a lot of questions that we need to start discussing. So really looking forward to what our two speakers are going to be telling us today. So we have Owen Mapley, who's going to be exploring the options open to government for reforming local authority finances and the areas where the sector could come together to achieve some of that change. And Stuart Hoggan to reflect on his experience as a former civil servant within MHCLG and how the sector could work together to achieve some of those changes as well. So I'm going to introduce, first of all, Owen Mapley, Chief Executive of CIPFA, appointed to CIPFA relatively recently, I believe. But before joining that, he was the Chief Executive of Hertfordshire County Council and has had many other leading roles as well in various organisations right across local government and in the civil servant. Following on from Owen will be Stuart Hoggan, who's worked in the civil service and a variety of policy areas with cabinet-level ministers in successive administrations. And Stuart's now moved on from the civil service and spends time in advisory roles for government departments and local authorities in academic research and consultancy work, and in public services, and is a member of the Court of the University of Glasgow as well as various other university committees. So first of all, Owen, over to you.
So hello, and lovely to see so many of you again. As you've just heard, I've been in this room many times as an officer over the years, always loved the network, and it's my first time up here on the floor. I've been in your shoes very recently. I absolutely get it. I know what you know, that council finances are under just the most acute pressure, and it's only getting harder. Reductions in the funding, increasing the scale and complexity of service demand, the inflationary cost spikes, workforce constraints, additional delivery demands from central government. We know that you're facing the perfect storm, and I know from my conversations with 151 officers almost on a weekly basis at the moment that the impact of those pressures is only getting harder, and it's getting harder and harder to close the gaps for coming years. We know that all of those challenges have been exacerbated by the local government funding system, which really hasn't been subjected to significant reform since the introduction of 50% business rates retention in 2013-14. But that reform itself was based on an even older review that informed it. So we've got to the stage where councils are operating in a dated, patched-up system where financial planning is hindered by a drip feed of one-year financial settlements, and sustainability is increasingly secured by one-off emergency grants or exceptional financial support from government. I would question whether that is either exceptional or even is particularly supportive, even now that the punitive interest rates that were applied last year have rightly been removed. In too many cases, that so-called support still resembles extending the mortgage to pay the gas bill, and that is not sustainable or effective long-term public financial management. So it's absolutely clear that the current system is fundamentally broken and needs to be reformed, but a bit of bottom line up front, there is just no easy answer to any of this. There is, of course, a clear risk that due to the extent of the ongoing pressures, that all parts of local government, all public services, focus their inquiries on simply calling for more and more, or just a bigger slice of an inadequate pie. But turning up the pressure on the funding hose to fill an increasingly leaky bucket makes no sense either. We know that many parts of the delivery side of our work is broken as well. I won't go through them. You've been going through it over the last couple of days, but the biggies around children's social care placements, SEND system that doesn't meet anybody's needs or satisfy anybody really, are really damaging, all whilst risking bankruptcy through both accounting treatment decisions or escalating homeschool transport costs as well. So it's inevitable in that sort of regime that there will be some calling for radical change. And I think it's absolutely fantastic that there are these voices calling for radical change and they need to be debated. Now, some of them I agree with, some of them I don't agree with. So, for example, we've heard recently about delivery through trusts or arm's length bodies, financial distribution models not agreed by ministers but by independent allocators or cross-party working groups. I think I'm concerned about that. Any tweak like that, however radical, I think it just, if it seeks to operate within the broken complexities of the current funding models, just risks tinkering and creating new grievances without actually addressing the underlying problems and without being true to the parliamentary accountability that we have through Westminster. So whilst I've said that simple answers are not possible, given the complexity, the extent to which the current systems are broken, and the intensity of current and operational financial demands, we need to see some things. So therefore, given all the above, I'd absolutely support those calls for a proper review that explores and debates the options to improve the local government funding system. That has to include a review of council tax alongside other council funding sources, including business rates, to see if a more viable and transparent model can be constructed, because surely 21st century demands and needs often most acutely felt around those people services, but trying to address them using Victorian-era models and at best 1990s hypothecated property values, just because it's hard to consider anything else, that would be deeply suboptimal. So it's easy to call for, and I think it's absolutely necessary, and we heard from Baroness Taylor that there is change coming, and it's likely to come fast, but I think it's insufficient in the face of such existential threats to council solvency. So I think we've got to see twin-tracked approaches needed with short to medium-term changes ahead of more fundamental reforms, which of course mirrors the approach to policy change that we're also hearing in many areas. So just considering for a moment a few of those short-term options, some of those we've all called for and look like they're about to start happening. Improving planning certainty and extending planning horizons to multi-year, been called for a long time and have been promised, but dependent on those being followed through in the spending review and regular refreshes thereafter, we still need to see that actually happening in practice. We have been promised this before. I vividly recall as a fresh new person into local government finance, I think it was 2016, 2017, we were promised multi-year stability on the production of a quote, efficiency plan. So, of course, all councils rolled out an efficiency plan. Really, it was just repackaged things we were already doing within our own councils, but we published them, and that long-term certainty lasted until the following year when there were major changes to reflect major pressures. So it's been promised before. We'll have to keep pressure to ensure that we see that. Second, I think simplification and reduction in numbers of bidding pots. We've heard it already a couple of times this morning. Again, there's promising rhetoric from the government on that. Now need to see that translated into reality. But I would argue not solely directed at strategic or combined authorities. It's not just MCAs that would benefit from single pots and fewer ring fences. Thirdly, I think we've got to see increasing flexibility on existing funding streams, even before there's other reforms. We know that over 70% of council funding comes through the big three of council tax, retained rates and sales fees and charges. And so I think there could be some much needed changes to those in the short term. Not everyone will agree. Council tax flexibility, there are some who say completely take off the referendum limits and leave it to local areas. There are others, and I think I'm probably one of those, who would say, yeah, but not only does that just retain the existing inequalities that we see between what they raise in different parts of the country, but is it right that such massive demand-led pressures should be shouldered mainly or solely on local areas and a regressive property tax? But there are arguments either way and about whether flexibility on council tax rates would be beneficial. Linked to that, discounts and exemptions, who should set them? Should it be local discretion? When should council tax become payable? Is it on granting of planning permission? Would those sorts of things encourage build-out rather than landlocking and so on? Business rates reliefs, greater flexibility, business rates multipliers, should there be freedom for local areas to differ from nationally set levels? And of course, things like charges. There are still a lot of things set centrally that if we freed up local areas, then that would be beneficial. Now, it does indeed sound, both from the budget statement itself that Stuart will say more about, but also from Baroness Taylor this morning and others, the government is going to start that process and probably start it really fast. So we're expecting the policy statement in the next couple of weeks. We're expecting the settlement, the draft settlement before Christmas. But of course, coming only weeks before the 25-26 financial year and the need to be setting budgets for them in February at council setting budget meetings, we've got to really think about that partnership that has been much trailed about the resetting of the co-working between central and local government. Because I think there is a risk that if there's material redistributions at very short notice, that could become the final straw for many councils that are really facing the brink. So however much that medium-term destination is attractive, I think we've got to have a discussion about transition and how you get there to ensure that however desirable it's set up, it doesn't become that final straw. Turning to the longer term, again, we've heard a bit about it this morning. There's got to be a review of need. And who could argue that need should not be at the heart of any allocation system? Of course it should be. But how on earth do you define need, given the massive changes in the nature of service delivery since the current, apparently needs-based formulas were constructed some years ago? Therefore, this work that is so urgent must include restarting work on the Fair Funding Review, or to give it its official name from before, the Review of Relative Needs and Resources. And it's crucial that this doesn't simply update the data in previous formulae or pick historical spend levels as some form of hypothecated need. For example, which year do you pick to baseline? Just one that I know personally pretty well from recent years. SEND, I know there's a session coming on shortly about special educational needs, but which year do you pick? Do you pick the year before it started escalating, during its escalation? Do you go to councils that have spent tens of millions, sometimes hundreds of millions more than they've been allocated with the size of the deficits we're now seeing? Or do you go to another council that, through whatever means, has found a way of constraining that somewhat? And so it's so different in different councils with different needs, it's going to be really difficult to find baselines that will please everybody. And we know also that when trying to address those needs, that the different spending powers we've had over the last couple of decades and the reductions that have happened in funding have had different impacts in different parts of the country. But there's no getting around the fact we simply have to go back to having that big open debate about what those needs are and whether they be based on deprivation, rurality, or many of the other things that you've heard this morning. We've got to have an open debate about what they are. Finally, new funding sources. We heard a few earlier, whether it's new rates, or new taxes rather, be it tourist or otherwise. or even the potential to assign shares from national taxes. And we've heard a lot about coming together to drive growth. So if the combined authorities and the delivery authorities could work together to say, well, this is our combined contribution to the national economy, this is what we need across this place to drive that trio that Andy Haldane was talking about, that could be a really interesting way to go. None of this, of course, is going to be easy. Any change involves winners and losers, and there are those, we heard it just this morning, saying, well, there must not be losers. But of course, there'll be plenty of people saying, but we've been losing over the last 20 years. And so you're never going to have a system that pleases everybody, but that debate, therefore, is absolutely needed. And my final thought is about capacity. There is so much that is needed in terms of reform to get into the preventative work on both children's, on adults, on special educational needs, on the restructuring of local government, the creation of new combined authorities. There's a huge amount going on. So I think part of that honest and open debate between councils and Whitehall needs to be where that constrained capacity in both Whitehall and in councils is best directed, because I'd love to think we can do all the above in the next 5 years, but I think that would probably be over-ambitious. So, Stuart, over to you.
Thank you very much indeed. And Stuart's got a few slides. We'll keep questions for following Stuart's presentation.
Good morning, everyone. Councillor Lewis was very kind in not mentioning that in my last job as a civil servant, I delivered 8 consecutive local government finance settlements and the programme of reform that was published in 2018, which means I've offended almost everyone in this room at one time or another. So let's see if we can do a bit better today in my new role as gamekeeper turned poacher. Owen's dealt with the big picture. I wanted to focus more specifically on the budget quote that's on the slide, reforming the approach to funding allocations within the local government finance settlement by redistributing funding to ensure it reflects an up-to-date assessment of needs and local revenues. That sounds an awful lot like the Fair Funding Review, doesn't it? This was the process that began in 2016 when Greg Clark was Secretary of State and ground to a halt in December 2018 when we published a couple of quite significant consultation papers. So what I want to do today is on the assumption that it proceeds along the lines that it was laid out previously, I want to give some sense of what the process might involve, how it might play out over the coming year, and what it might feel like to be on the end of it. So I've set out the major elements of reform there, but we don't have time today to go through each of those in detail. But I wanted to pick out 3 areas where I think ministers have significant discretion to exercise judgment in the outcome of the review, and those are the areas in turn that you will no doubt want to talk to ministers about. And the first of those is the reset of accumulated business rates growth. So this is an intrinsic feature of the business rates retention system. It was set out at the outset by Eric Pickles before the introduction in 13-14. It was slated for implementation in 2019. It's now very overdue. And the process is to recover accumulated growth to the department and redistribute it using new needs-based formulas on a relative needs basis. The element of discretion is, of course, what's dubbed the percentage reset. In other words, how much of the growth is recovered for redistribution and how much remains, let's say, indefinitely with the authorities where the growth was generated. And that's an open question at this stage. The second area I want to focus on is resources equalisation, mentioned by your chair in his introductory remarks yesterday. So this is a way of adjusting the grant to take account of the relative size of the council tax base across the country. It doesn't take account of the council tax level that you charge, it's the size of the tax base, so the number of houses and the value of the tax base. And again, this is a very well-precedented approach, which has always been present in settlement distributions. It was there in the 13-14 settlement. It's not been updated since then. And the choice for ministers is the percentage equalisation that they want to pursue. In other words, how much of the grant remains with local authorities, reflecting their local tax bases, and how much is recovered and redistributed to other areas. So there's a big impact there, and there's a big element of discretion. And the final area that I wanted to focus on is the transition arrangements. The proposals before were for a kind of glide path from where the authority is now to the intended destination under reform. And that would take place over a number of years, which I suspect, for reasons I'll come back to later, will extend beyond the period of the spending review. I don't think we'll get there within the period of the spending review. And the amount of resources that's available in the system to smooth that glide path is critically important. And the tension which arises is in effect that the relative winners from the process are slowed down in order to help protect the relative losers in the process. So there's a clear tension there. Okay, let's move on then to the implications of the process. First of all, timing and approach. What I think we're looking at is a multi-year settlement aligned with the spending review timescales, which might be 2 or 3 years, not yet determined, which will give a degree of forward certainty. The final proposals for allocations will become clear at the provisional settlement for the year 26-27, so let's say December 2025. And that's followed by a vote in Parliament, which I think is quite important in 2026, quite important to the handling of the process. That means that the next calendar year, 2025, will be very much taken up with consultation and engagement in the process. The aim is to, I think, in effect, catch up with where we got to before and overtake that process. That is a very tight timetable, I mean, notwithstanding the progress that was made before. And it's made even worse by the fact that you've really got to do the whole package. You can't just cherry pick bits of it or do bits of it now and a bit more later. It's not only does it exist as a coherent package, but if you miss any bit out, you're going to have a group of authorities that say, well, if you had done that bit, that would benefit me, and why did you leave that bit out? And I don't think that's a good answer to that. So you've got to do the full package. We won't see any draft allocations until after the spending review concludes in the spring, but the department will want to make some progress beforehand. And we heard this morning from the Minister, as I think we would have expected, there's a policy statement planned for later this month, and that will set out the plan for the coming year, I expect. I think important in that will be the principles for the review. So these were included in a prior consultation in December 2017. And at the time, we set out simplicity, transparency, contemporary, sustainability, robustness, and stability. In short, using the best available analytical and statistical techniques and the latest evidence, strong evidence, to guide the process. So making it as far as possible a defensible, evidence-based process. I suspect ministers will follow a similar course. That would be my bet. So what does that mean for the impact on distribution for the end answer. Well, bearing in mind, of course, it's very likely that no decisions will be taken on this process right at this stage. We can certainly observe that it's been a very long time since the data has been updated. So it's changed a lot across the country. We proposed a whole series of new formulas, including significant new formulas for adults and children's services, which are not in the public domain yet, that were developed by outside experts and academics. So if those are used, those will be a big step forward from where we are now, but obviously will have an impact that we're not yet clear about. But it's not just the findings of the review that's important. What's also critical is the unclear baseline for the review, the baseline for change. By the point of implementation, we'll have seen an astounding 7 one-year settlements, each of them tactical short-term adjustments, which have left authorities in a whole variety of different pictures remote from the original baseline. So what that means, I think, is that there is potentially very large shifts in resources here with significant outliers. So even in this room, there will be a variety of different outcomes depending on your local circumstances, and potentially some very large outliers depending on specific local circumstances. This is important stuff. So there's immediately here a tension between stability and reform, isn't there? There's a short-term gain, some financial resilience for people staying where they are, but there's also, I think, a longer-term game in terms of financial resilience by using the available resources in the best way that we can. There's also a tension between speed and proper process. Government will obviously want to take as much of the sector as they can with them as part of this process, but speed will obviously mean it's difficult to achieve that if it's going to be fitted in the next calendar year. And the available resources, as I said earlier, is critical. And there are so many lenses on this, aren't there? There's not just classes of authority, like the audience today, but there's an urban-rural lens, there's a regional lens, there's all sorts of different perspectives that ministers will want to take account. So how should the sector respond? Well, these are processes that history shows take substantial time and energy and a lot of political capital, not only at national level, but also at local level. And ministers will want to get as much support as they can for this sector. I think it's worthwhile reflecting why it didn't move forward the last time. There were obviously reasons around Brexit and COVID, but I think it was also important that the government at the time had quite a small majority and was not confident of being able to get proposals through, I would suggest. There's a larger majority now, but a much broader representation in Parliament, and of course very high expectations, which will really prove challenging, I think. And then standing back from that, it's going to be a really, really busy year, isn't it? There was a sense that the budget pressed the starting gun for all of this. We'll see stuff on devolution over the coming year, on reorganisation, on service reform, as Andy mentioned this morning. It's critically undercooked at the moment. I hope something on central local relations, separate from devolution, but how are those governed in the future? We've got stuff on business rates tax reform, and the audit system is a complete mess. So there's a massive agenda there in which the government appears to be doing as much as possible, as soon as possible, within real constraints of time, money, and legal security. So for the sector, there's obviously an issue of capacity, as Owen mentioned, both overall capacity to engage, but also technical capacity. These things are quite complicated, of course. You are fortunate, I think, to have a very strong team in CCN with Pixel in support. So you have a good basis to start that dialogue. But the challenge is the extent to which you can be unified around this. The department, I think, will be appealing to the principles that I mentioned earlier as governing the way that they're taking this forward, and also to a degree of pragmatism. As Owen said, not everyone is going to win, but if the argument's won at a level of principle, then they can argue that they're doing the right thing by way of public policy. But for the sector, the key is unity, isn't it? Can you collaborate to get meaningful leverage and influence? That's helpful in influencing Treasury, of course, but it's also helpful in making changes that you might want to see in the proposals. This is very, very challenging, but what is the alternative? Is it divide and rule? Is it more of a sense of this being done to you than with you? So that is the challenge that I wanted to leave you with. Thank you.
Well, I did say that was going to be an ambitious session, and there's an awful lot in there to unpack. Lots of implications, I think, for local government. I think one of the biggest things that we have to deal with is system complexity. There's a lot of moving parts to what's going on in here. So we've heard about the potential for reforming public finances and how we can do that and what it entails. Well, that's against a backdrop of ongoing Devo drive that's likely to be coming, conversations we're having around public sector reform, LGR and all that kind of stuff going on. And then the current issue is that a lot of local authorities are kind of locked into this kind of death spiral of having to deal with increased demand and ongoing pressures on all of our budgets, particularly around SEND and adult social care and children's services, care homes, lots and lots of things like that. So thank you very much indeed for those presentations. I'm going to open this up now to the floor, and over right at the back I can see I've got Martin Tepp.
Sorry, habitual questioner on these topics. I've listened to government ministers at the LGA conference, then I heard Sharon Taylor earlier today. It does appear that deprivation will be the key metric that's in the mind of government at the moment when they look certainly on the next year's settlement, which will be a one-year settlement, and then reforming the system thereafter. To my mind, what should unify us in this room is that ignores so many other pressures that don't relate solely to deprivation. You know, and all parts of the country experience lots of pressures in terms of their own cost bases based on rurality and other factors. The question I just wanted to ask you was about the fairness of the timing of this, because I don't know about everybody else in this room, you know, we have to put a budget out for consultation straight after Christmas. You know, we're not going to get the announcement in the local government settlement until immediately before Christmas. Now, we're going to have people literally working between Christmas and New Year to turn the handle on the numbers, because none of the normal mechanisms for actually second-guessing what the numbers will be like will come into play, because they're going to change all the metrics. So we're going to be faced with a situation literally working over Christmas to completely revamp our budget, potentially, to then put it out of consultation virtually the day after Christmas. And that just strikes me as totally unreasonable, quite frankly, and totally unfair, and just puts even more pressure on an already very hard-pressed sector.
What's up? Yeah.
Shall I take that one? Let me deal with the timing issue first. I'm not going to try to defend the timing issue. We've fallen into a very damaging pattern in recent years with a late autumn statement finalising the numbers and then a process of policy resolution and quality assurance that leads to late settlement. And that issue doesn't get enough attention, in my view, as an inhibitor to sensible budget planning. It's at least as important as longer-term settlements. And so I'm glad you raised it. I had said in earlier talks that I hoped that a spring spending review would mean an earlier settlement in the following year. Much less confident of that now if there's going to be an attempt to implement major finance reform in that period. Can I just add something on deprivation? So I'll take it in two bits. First of all, the longer-term review. The aim of the longer-term review is to construct an evidence-based, balanced assessment of the relative needs moving forward. And there is little or no role for a direct deprivation intervention in that process, in the proposals that we set out. For example, I mentioned large adults and children's formulas. They don't have like an external intervention of a deprivation weight in them. So that's not to say that the outcome as a whole will not give more emphasis to deprivation, but it doesn't come in a crude exercise of ministerial judgment. That's in future years. In next year, 1 year, the upcoming 1 year settlement, it does appear that ministers are minded to make some sort of deprivation response, what was described, I think, as a declaration this morning. And I don't know what's in their mind. My guess is that they would like the settlement to move in the direction that they anticipate reform will go in, and certainly not to take them further from what they regard as the likely end destination. And that may be what's they have in mind, I don't know. They may also have in mind the IFS work, which shows that cuts to local authorities over the last 14 years have been disproportionately on high deprivation authorities. We won't know until we see the policy statement what the rationale is for that. But that kind of, if you like, external intervention in that way is, I hope, a 1 year factor. It's not to prejudge the outcome of the review more generally, but it's not, dare I say, as crude as that. It doesn't require that kind of exercise of judgment.
Okay, thank you. Ellie.
It's happened before. I remember coming in the settlement at December 2015, just before I joined local government. There was outrage at proposed changes that were much more significant than had been anticipated. That was heard loud and clear in the consultation on the draft settlement, and transitional arrangements were brought in. I'm not predicting that's what will happen, but I know that there are some very professional lobby groups out there, including this one, who will make it plain how they feel if there's a systemic shift in just weeks of notice. So to an extent, it's like 'twas ever thus. I'm not saying that's right or fair, but that's how the system has been working. And to an element, well, what's the alternative? Do we wait another year to do it? Do we wait until the summer? I think it's got to be linked in with the spending review that really gets into the structural changes needed and the policy changes needed. So absolutely not ideal. And it does contribute to a lot of the pressures that we're hearing from finance staff, that I know it's a whole council effort to close a budget, but the fact that budget setting and planning is now an all year round affair does crowd out a lot of the other things that they should be working on in partnership with you in terms of the value for money, the reforms, the efficiencies, and indeed the attractiveness of the profession itself. So we'll be watching very closely and trying to support the finance professionals in the same way that you'll be supporting councillor colleagues and senior officers across your councils.
There was a chap in the back. Yeah, that's the one next to the aisle.
Thanks. A very good session so far. Richard Bell, Cabinet Member for Finance in Durham. I'd just like to explore a little bit about where you think business rates are going. I'm curious as to why the last government didn't seek to implement any kind of business rates growth reset, because I suspect the disparity in this room between authorities is much greater in business rates than it is in actual council tax base. I don't know, but I suspect it's very large indeed. So why did the last government fight shy of implementing that business rates reset? And where do you see business rates going? Because we're all, I'm sure we're sitting here with towns, town centre shops, high streets that we've got vacancies in. Probably a lot of us sitting with big distribution warehouses built by Amazon thinking they aren't paying a lot. We probably all think the system's totally broken, but yet businesses have got to pay something. So where do you see that going, and how do you see it being addressed in terms of the disparities across the country?
So if we can get some snappy answers, because I would like to...
No, absolutely. Is it any different from what we've seen on council tax? It's completely, historically, unrelated to current approaches, the Amazon example you've just given. We know that there's even bigger disparities sometimes. I know London Borough chief execs who've moved between boroughs and they say, well, in my previous borough, the entire rates that were collected from all the businesses were dwarfed by the single big business that I moved to in a different type of economy in that borough. So I think it needs fundamental review. We know that every year in the budget there seems to be ever more complex reliefs and offsets that are given, which if we're after simplicity and single pots, that doesn't help. So I don't have a snappy answer to what could replace it, and clearly there needs to be a contribution to replace that funding, but just tweaking with the current system is as difficult as just tweaking with the current inadequate council tax system, in my view.
I think the short answer on the reset is it became caught up with the review of needs allocations. The feeling was that there was a need for an up-to-date allocation formula in order to reallocate the money in the best way possible. I mean, I think it's also the case that it was politically difficult for the government, and it's also practically difficult. There's a bit of a sense in the original schema of let growth accumulate and then reset it, that the money is somehow additional, but as you well know, it is used to fund core services, and the notion of taking up money away is not a straightforward one. On business rates future, I think it's interesting the way that the dialogue changed, the rhetoric changed, and before the election it was fundamental reform to replace business rates. And the government seems to have gone around the same loop as their predecessors did a number of times, which is to decide that it's actually quite an important tax, that it's more up to date than council tax through revaluations. It raises a lot of money, and therefore they brought forward some more limited reforms aimed at transformation and fairness. So I suspect that's all we will see for the foreseeable future.
Okay, we've probably got time for one very quick question, if there is any more from the floor at all. Right at the back, Martin again. Another Martin.
How to reform local government finance? Can't you just make it simpler? I never understood, how basically on population and activity, and we end up haggling over ridiculous formulas. And if you're going to reform it, just simplify it so everybody gets something based on population and the activity you're doing. It's quite simple, and then a little bit of leeway, tiny bit of leeway for special cases. Because currently it's mad, what we do at the moment, isn't it?
That was amazingly short for Martin. Well done.
Yeah. So simplification was one of our objectives. The set of proposals that we came forward with was certainly a great deal simpler than the earlier 4-block model, which I don't think anyone understood. But of course, the reason that you move away from the simplest approach, which is just simply a per capita distribution, perhaps based on specific populations of older people and children, is that you have powerful lobby groups and other departments that say, oh, it's not as straightforward as that. We need something that takes account of X and Y, and that's what pushes you away from an ideal simplification. But the really complex issue is actually business rates retention and the way that that's reflected in the system. We haven't heard anything from the government on that at all, and that's maybe a second-term issue if they're keen to handle it. But does anyone really believe that that's a serious incentive any longer? And is it doing any more than increasing risks and complexity in the system? I'll leave that thought with you.
Okay, I'm afraid we're going to have to guillotine it there. I know that was the most riveting session of the entire conference. So thank you very much indeed for attending, and thank you very much indeed for Ellen and Stuart.
I think we're ready to start.
Okay, let's go.
Can I just check the mics are working and you can hear us? I think I can. Good. Good afternoon and welcome to the final session of this conference. And welcome to this session, which has the snappy title, Achieving Consensus on SEND Reform. I think I'm right that this is the first time that special educational needs and disability has been formally billed on the agenda at one of these conferences. I appreciate that sort of agenda with a lowercase a. This has been on our collective agenda for many a time, but I'm delighted to be asked to come and chair this session. My name is Ben Bryan. I'm from an organisation called ISOS Partnership. I think the reason I was asked to chair this session is that with some of my colleagues, we led and produced a research report commissioned by the County Councils Network and the Local Government Association, published in July, that is one of a number of growing contributions to the call for reform of what we call the SEND system. In that report, we argued very strongly that the system was, and again, these words are all used very deliberately and very advisedly, the system was broken, that reform was urgent and unavoidable, and we set out quite a chunky set of 8 broad recommendations for a new approach to inclusion, support for children and young people with additional needs. Crucially, in that report, we argued strongly against falling into a sort of blame game of different sectors saying all the problems in the SEND system are because this group of people or this type of organisation or this body is acting in this way. And actually what we argued was we've created inadvertently a national system that sets local authorities and health services and education settings and families up to fail and sets them against one another. And actually where we should be training our view is on the national system. So in what we argued in the report, we said, while it's important not to be fatalistic about what can be done within the confines of individual institutions, organisations, local areas, we also had to be realistic and united in terms of demanding a better collective system nationally and making that demand to central government. The risk is that if we don't emphasise what we agree on and also talk honestly and openly about where we don't agree but where we need to find a way forward, all government will hear is different sectors squabbling amongst each other about small differences, and the SEND issue, as it were, will just seem it's too hard, it's too complicated. So the reason for the word consensus in the title of this particular session is to emphasise we need to find a way forward. And we've got a brilliant panel of colleagues who represent a range of different perspectives, roles within the SEND system. But today's session won't focus on our report and why the system is broken or what's caused it, but instead we'll focus on how do we move forward with reform and what are the key things that we need to take forward in terms of substance and policy, but also the sort of the style in which we do that. So how we build consensus across the different parties, as it were, that have a significant interest in having an approach that supports children and young people with additional needs effectively. So we're going to hear from our 3 speakers. Each speaker, we've given them a key question, which is if you were sort of nominally in charge of policy in this area to some extent, what are the 3 most important things that you would do to improve the system and how it supports children and young people with special educational needs? We're going to hear first from Dame Christine Lenahan. Many of you will know Christine. This is actually a much simpler introduction to give now, because if you've been following the news, you will know that Christine, not listing all her previous achievements, but is now the government strategic advisor on special educational needs and disability. So, Christine, I'm going to come to you first. 5 minutes. What will your top 3 priorities be?
Okay, thanks, Ben. And yeah, my role as a strategic advisor was announced last week, which was good. Maybe next week I'll know what it means. So if you're expecting me to be completely up to date with government policy, I'm afraid I'm not. But from my experience, I want to talk to you about what I think matters. I think the first thing at this level for this audience is we need clarity on statutory override. And my worry for that is it just dominates thinking. It stops us being creative. It stops us thinking what we need to do. All we think about is what's going to happen, what's going to happen, what's going to happen. I'm not saying I know what that will be, but I'm saying it's important that we actually take it head on. I think that the second thing for me is what comes out in the noise of the SEND system is what you were saying and you were saying, the brokenness, the crisis, or whatever. What we are not yet able to articulate and what we need government to articulate is an absolute clear vision about where we want to get to. And how within that clear vision we take the different parties along the way. Otherwise, people open their mouths at schools. Schools are going to be really angry, we can't do that. Parents will think their rights are being taken away. Councils will not be able to do it. What is it? So what's that collective clear vision that we're trying to get to? And I want to pay tribute to Hertfordshire and Nottinghamshire. So I've been working with the two of them since they were judged by Ofsted as having systemic failure in their local area in SEND. Can I tell you what we have been able to achieve in the last year, 18 months, because there is a shared vision, because there is a level of mutual understanding, with all of the faults of the system still there, has been phenomenal. So actually we can move and we can change if we're really clear about where we want to go to and how we want to get there. And so many of the issues, for those of you who heard the Care Placements report this morning, cross over into this. I think the second thing for me is about whole child and family approaches. Let's bring back early years, early identification, early diagnosis. Let's understand what school readiness means as children come in. We cannot get to a point in an SEND system where we're approaching 20% of children needing the HC plans. That is actually not good for children, and it's not good for the system. So it's that lack of early years support and intervention, that understanding of that whole school pathway. What do we expect an inclusive mainstream school to do with the right support in the right place? What do we expect out of special schools? What role, if any, does the independent and non-maintained sector play? But what does it look like? Can we stand back from the noise and understand the system? And somebody talked earlier about HE and colleges and whatever. And what do we do about that? I am frustrated by the poverty of aspiration for the groups of children I serve. I want them to go into the community as adults who are contributing and part of. The system's holding them back. And the last thing is I need to sort out accountability. Our accountability mechanisms between schools and local authorities are not strong enough and not good enough, and our accountability systems with health are poor and undeveloped. So there's a real issue about accountability, vision, and clarity for me.
Thank you, Christine. And we're going to hear next from James Bowen. James is the Assistant General Secretary of the National Association of Head Teachers, formerly a head teacher of a junior school in Hampshire, and a range of other roles in school leadership. James, you may want to respond to Christine and kind of add your top three.
I will do, and good afternoon, everyone. I'm going to caveat my three with, if I were in Bridget Phillipson's shoes today, I think my first caveat would be I would definitely continue to knock on the Chancellor's door. I think that the £1 billion extra we heard about in the budget last week is obviously positive. I think we have to be honest about there is still a huge gap there. You look at the scale of deficits around councils across the country, and I'm not one of these people who just thinks that money is the sole answer to all of this, but I think even when we look at the systemic reforms that I think we need, and I think we do need fundamental systemic reform, it's going to need some investment. And I don't think the level of funding is adequate for what's required. So my caveat to my three is I think that Bridget Phillipson will need to continue to ask the Chancellor for additional funding. In terms of kind of three specifics, if I were the Secretary of State, I think I would be very much focusing on rebuilding those crucial specialist services, and I would also be focusing very much in early years. So I think for me, a big priority, there's a long list there, but I'd be looking at rebuilding the health visiting workforce. Too many children, very young children, don't get the checks they need. You look at the recent report from the health visitors who say they just don't have the staff to do it. We need to make sure that every child has that early check. If we don't identify early on, if we don't get it right in the early years, we're not going to get it right further downstream. So I think a focus on early years and those support services would be my number one. I think my second thing, we have a curriculum and assessment review that's currently live. I think if I were the Secretary of State, I'd be directing that review to put SEND front and centre. Too often, SEND has been an afterthought when it comes to curriculum and assessment, and I think it certainly was the last time we had a review. We need to turn that on its head. We need to say, have we got a curriculum that serves the needs of all children? Do we have an assessment system that does that? I think currently there's a number of parts of the assessment system that actually work against that ambition. And I think some of the increase we've seen in SEND is linked to the assessment system we have. And I think there's a connection there around accountability as well. We have, with the assessment system, we have an accountability system which injects all sorts of perverse incentives into the system when you look at things like EBAC and all other sort of pressures on schools and the way we focus very much on academic achievement at the expense of everything else. So, and I think to be fair to the Secretary of State, she's doing this. I think I'd be saying focus on SEND within that curriculum and assessment review. There is an opportunity here because that curriculum has to be right for all pupils, not 80% of pupils as it currently is. And I think my third one, I actually, just to show I've read the report, I looked closely at the report, and I think there's a recommendation in there, which the more I've thought about it, the more I think there's really something in that. And that's this idea of a National Institute for Inclusive Education. I do think it's quite remarkable, really. We have a country where we have multiple different SEND systems. We don't have a sense of a kind of national SEND system. We have lots of regional, local SEND systems. And I think actually it's long overdue that we do have a kind of, if you like, kind of health have nice, don't they? Something along those lines where we talk about kind of set of national standards, a set of kind of national expectations for schools. I think that kind of a national hub for training for schools. If we're going to move to a more inclusive mainstream approach, let's make sure we have a really high quality national hub leading that. And that's not to take away from the brilliant local work, but I think the more we can start talking about that kind of national consistency, it allows us then to support schools to be more inclusive. So there's about 1,000,001 other things I could have, but I'm going to stick with those three to start us off.
Those three are brilliant, and I'm sure some of the other points may well come out in the questions that we have afterwards. I'm going to come to our last speaker and then just try and tease out a couple of kind of themes that have come through this conversation and then open up to the audience. We're going to hear next from Councillor Kate Fole, Councillor in Nottinghamshire County Council, but also the County Council Network's spokesperson on SEND and education. So, Kate.
Thank you. I have to say, I feel kind of slightly kind of awkward sitting this this wonderful panel of experts. I am just a councillor who has been a lead member for children's social care a little while ago, and a school governor. So I can't have anything like the understanding and the insight that these wonderful practitioners have had and experience have had. But I'll do my very best, and so I think mine will be a little bit more simple, I think, and perhaps a little bit less insightful for you. But I think the first thing I would do is make sure that everybody is getting the message that this system cannot be tinkered with, it is broken and it needs reform. And I think we can't say that often enough, because I think there are some people that still need to be persuaded that that is the case. I mean, how many of us in speaking, certainly from a councillor point of view, and I'm sure some of you have experienced this, how many of us have sat in a room with exhausted and frustrated parents that are desperately trying to get the care and support that they need in schools for their children. They're doing the very best, they're working really hard, but it's adversarial and it shouldn't be. They shouldn't be put in that position, the help should be there. And schools telling them that they just can't provide the service that they need. Senkos, I've had Senkos ring me up and say, we've got no money and we've got these high-level needs kids. There isn't enough money in this budget to kind of help these children. We're absolutely desperate. And again, going back to what Christine was just saying about Nottinghamshire, there's some fantastic staff in Nottinghamshire County Council doing some really, really good work. But there is not enough resource. There aren't enough of them, and there is not enough money in the system. And I know, it's not all about money, but money is really important. And I think if anybody is not convinced about the need for change, I really recommend the report to you. It is called Towards an Effective and Financially Sustainable Approach to SEND England. It's commissioned by the County Council Network and the LGA, and Ben's just been leading on this and doing a fantastic job. So thank you. And I think. But it's a long read, but it's a really good read, and I don't think I've read a better report that's really well researched, really well evidenced, and really well argued. I think it's really good, and it's one of the best I've ever seen. But yes, on to the money. We cannot ignore money, can we? There really is a financial crisis. I mean, one of the phrases that's been kind of going around kind of here a lot today is we can't wait until there's a burning platform. Well, I think the SEND platforms is burning already.
Not much left.
Absolutely, there's not really much left. And yeah, we've already talked about statutory override. And it's not hypothetical. The money that's in the statutory override is spent money. There's over 3 billion of it. It's a big sum of money. And councils will go bankrupt if it's not tackled. And it's not just the councils with the statutory override. Those people who've managed not to kind of need to go down that route or wanted to go down that route, they've got serious kind of problems too. It's right the way across the country, and I think it's really difficult. And the new money's welcome, great, isn't it? It's wonderful, but sadly, I don't think it's enough. The third thing I wanted to say is, and I was going to do the Tony Blair thing, and I think I was going to say inclusion, yeah. Because I think if we're going to do this and we're going to make it work, mainstream schools have got to be better provided for, better supported. The culture has got to be more inclusive for children, so more children with SEND can go to mainstream schools and thrive with their peers. I think that's really important. And I'm going to quote Bridget Phillipson here, who gave a talk quite recently to the Federation of School Trusts. So hopefully we're knocking on an open door. If we want to transform the outcomes of all young people with SEND, children need to feel that they belong in school. This government will always be strong on standards, which is we really can't lose that, although I think the curriculum needs looking at, but there we go, it's another issue. Because if we fall into that trap of chasing a narrow shade of standards, structures driven rather than child focused, then children with SEND get swept to the side and attendance crashes. But achieving and thriving together, that's what gave me a brighter future. So hopefully we're knocking on an open door. I think we probably are. But my view is as well that if we do that, if we get inclusivity in schools, we get the curriculum right. I think there's some work to be done around professional development for teachers to manage with them. Often they've come to me and said, we didn't know much about SEND until we stood in the classroom. Yeah. I think that all needs to be tackled as well. If we do that, get inclusive cultures in all our schools, all our children will thrive, not just the ones with SEND. Brilliant. Thank you.
Thank you, Kate. And just while people are kind of absorbing that and formulating their questions, I want to just use Chair's prerogative and just ask a kind of couple. I guess one really simple one, through your networks, you will be having conversations with representatives from national government. We're hearing, obviously, the speeches that the Secretary of State and others are making. We've heard the budget announcement. How optimistic are you that the sort of messages that you have echoed today, that there is a kind of receptive ear? To me, it feels very different. When we wrote the report, the bulk of the work we did was pre-election, without prejudging what the outcome would be. It feels different now, but it also feels like we're slightly waiting for the pieces to land. I just want to get your sense of kind of how optimistic. Kate, you might want to kick off, and I'll come back this way.
Yes, I'm certainly a lot more hopeful. I think they get it. I mean, one of the big things as well that I was going to say and didn't is as well. I mean, if we're going to create this inclusivity and kind of crack it kind of at school level, you know, we need better support in schools. And actually, the Ofsted framework needs to change so it actually kind of rewards schools that are inclusive and actually embraces children with SEND much more. And Bridget Phillips, that has been mentioned several times by government. So I'm hopeful. Yeah, I'm hopeful.
James.
Yeah, so we have been fortunate enough to be sort of sat round the table with Bridget Phillipson, and I think she gets it. I think this government get it. You know, when we sat down, I don't think I'm breaking any confidences when the Secretary of State said to us, SEND is the #1 crisis. So I think they understand it, so I'm kind of reassured there. If I'm honest, I don't think yet they've found out what the solutions are. But I think that's because the solutions are complex and multifaceted. This is not, if there were easy solutions, we would have done this 10 years ago. You know, a number of governments have tried and failed, frankly. So, and I think the other bit of nervousness for me is around the funding side of it, that there's a financial reality which we're all aware of, and that makes me nervous. But I'm more optimistic now because I think there is a kind of concerted effort in government to really get to grips with this and to really listen. And of course, Christine is now on board, so I should be optimistic because she'll fix it all by next week.
I was going to say, you stole my line, because I was going to say the clarity in your job description, Christine, next week may well be come up with a solution. But your levels of optimism.
Yeah, I think Kate and James are both right. I think government gets it. They know the crisis there and whatever. What I think holds people back, and what I was trying to get to before, is what's the end state? Where are we getting to? So that clarity of vision is really, really important. And I think part of my role with ministers is to tell them to be brave. And the reason for that is I've worked with, you know, people like you for years, with your DCSs, with your people, and as members in particular, you have also told me of the anger of parents, of the despair of parents, and in some cases, in some of the work we've been doing, the sheer vitriol of parents. Now, don't get me wrong, I don't blame parents. If my children had had special educational needs, I'd be there. I want the very best for them, like we all want the very best. But there is a fear factor on reform. There's a fear factor that the minute we start to say, a bit like the finance stuff, we are going forward, there will be backlash. There will be parents who say, you're taking our children's rights away. There will be schools who say, you're not interested in attainment anymore. There will be systems that say, we're not doing it with no money. We have a health system that's teetering. Can we take it with us? And whatever. So the fear factors in this are really high. And so it's somehow or other part of the role of everyone to hold consensus. And to me, that's going to be the key. And one of the only words in my role that I understand is your job is to help consensus.
And I guess on that point, you all, I think, talked about inclusion and inclusivity.
Absolutely.
And in a sense, one of the things that we often get asked when we talk about our report is, well, what do you mean by inclusion? What's the kind of... And in a sense, my argument is always, that's a kind of slightly different question, and that's a bigger piece of work to work out what inclusion looks like in practice. But the kind of principle of, actually, we have a cohort, a population of children and young people, some of whom have more additional needs, some of whom need additional support at different times, some of whom will just sail through, you know, fairly seamlessly. But in a sense, they all have to live, when they finish education and they finish this thing called the SEND system, they'll have to live together. So in a sense, our argument was, let's have the debate about inclusion and the vision and the end state. But in a sense, we have to kind of commit to that principle first off. I guess I'd just be interested in your sort of reflections on inclusion, because it feels like the one pillar of our report that whenever we talk about it, generally there is agreement on the principle. There's the question then about, well, how do you do it and what does it look like and how do you measure it, et cetera, et cetera. James, I don't know if you want to go first on this one.
So I think there is a danger sometimes when we talk about inclusion. We have quite a simplistic model of inclusion. And it's this model of, it's either mainstream or it's special education. And these are sort of binary choices, and they're two separate islands. I think we need to move away from that. I think we need to think much more about moving those two providers much closer together. And I think there's an opportunity, and I think the government are thinking in this area, which is quite exciting, which is where we start saying, well, how do we get special education, resource provision, AP, and mainstream working closer together? So for me, the way to solve inclusion isn't just to make an announcement next week and say, right, we want mainstream schools to be more inclusive, off you go, make it happen. It won't happen. No. What we need to start thinking about is, actually, do we start building resource provision units around mainstream schools so children can move between them? So you might have some time in resource provision, some time in mainstream. That kind of movement between the two. How do we get mainstream schools to learn from the expertise of those special schools? There's opportunities for amazing outreach work, which have largely dried up in the last decade. It was a big thing, outreach, and it had a really positive impact. And an awful lot of providers now get the schools saying, can't do it anymore. We need to rebuild that. So I think for me, it's about moving away from that simplistic model of inclusion is this or that. No, we need to kind of move things close together and have much more movement between the two parts of the sector.
Christine?
I think James is right. I mean, one of the things that the Secretary of State also announced last week was the appointment of Tom Rees. So Tom's part of the Confederation of School Trusts. He is a passionate advocate of inclusion, partly because he's also a parent himself, but partly because he's seen it work. And there is something for me, you know, when you're looking at big change, you start with a coalition of the willing. So you bring the best together and you say, yes, you can build these relationships. We can stop special schools being the one for the funny kid at the end of the road. We can bring them into the community. We can make that happen. That's what I was looking at in Nottinghamshire yesterday. How do we make those links between mainstream and special? What does it look like? So I think you're right. And it's something about moving the narrative into clear what's possible without getting lost almost in a sort of endless conversation about, well, what about this child or that child or that child? But what's the culture that you're trying to create.
And I just build on that. I think it's so important. We need to give parents the confidence
Totally.
that mainstream education, or that, frankly, whatever it is, meets their children's needs. So we can build what we just perceive to be a very inclusive system. If parents say, but what my child needs is that over there, it's that different type of vision. We've got to get to a stage where we build confidence of teachers, of parents, where we say, these needs can be met in a largely mainstream setting. Now, it's not the same as what every other child may be in the school. It's going to be a bit more specialist, but we have to build that confidence. Otherwise, we're going to carry on with the same process we've got now, which is parents saying, I know I need the specialist place. And I've seen that being on the receiving end.
It's really interesting, and Kate, I think I'll bring you in a moment. You used the word belonging, and it's interesting in the report that we did, and I mean, this is one of a number of conversations that have been happening for a decade about what we call the SEND system and people's experiences of it. But in a sense, what people asked for, when we asked parents and carers or young people what it was they were looking for, or the support, a sense of belonging, there weren't things that kind of, you had to build a different kind of building and segregate children and put them in there, or you had to have this hugely complex sort of piece of work around a statutory assessment and a plan. Actually, they were really quite basic things about a sense of feeling understood, belonging, wanted from young people and from parents and carers. Kind of the quote that stayed with me from the report was, a parent said to us, I just don't want to have to, be called by a school saying, can you come and pick up your child, because we can't, and again, there's no blame there. Just your view on the kind of how you put inclusivity sort of at the heart of the system.
I think, again, I'm going to be quite kind of simple way, because I think the question that I would perhaps ask, then to get into kind of first consultation, is what is it that makes children not want to come to school? What is it that actually would make them actually enjoy their learning more? And I think you hit the nail on the head there, because I think if you can identify that, which I think probably we could all have a rough go at what that might be, but if we could do that, and then you had the specialist support there first. I mean, how often do we talk about early intervention? All the while. If we had the specialist support there to help that child, to enable them to actually find out what it was that was stopping them from coming to school, try and kind of solve that for them, try and make them more confident, and then I think that would be a really kind of huge step. I mean, the trouble is, when you have some of these kind of conversations, children with SEND are kind of seen as a problem, aren't they? And from a financial point of view, I don't want to make light of that, because it does create more difficulties. But they're all children, and we need to kind of think, well, actually, how can we make all these children in this school comfortable, happy, learning and thriving? And I think that's the kind of question we need to ask. Perhaps we need to ask some more children.
I'm going to open up to questions. What I'm going to try and do is just take sort of 3 at a time. If you can just say your name and council or other organisation, if you're from another organisation, sort of direct questions best, and then I'll try and kind of apportion them to the panel. So, lady here, gentleman here, and then lady in the sort of middle here in the hand up. We'll go in that order.
Hi, thank you very much. Good afternoon. Caroline Clapper, Hertfordshire County Council, lead member for education. Thank you very much to all of you. Particular thank you to Dame Christine Lenehan, who's been working very closely with us, and congratulations on your elevation. It is very richly deserved. As you know, we're working very hard to deliver our SEND improvement journey at Hertfordshire County Council, and we talk about education, health, care plans and accountability. So I suppose what I wanted to know is, how can councils encourage our health partners to enhance their contributions towards SEND support? Thank you.
That's good. So come over here next.
Okay, thank you. My name's Paul Marshall. I'm the leader for West Sussex County Council. And entirely agree, we need a consensus for what that journey needs to be and what that outcome. But I think one of the key stakeholders is the legal system. Yeah. Because ultimately, people go through this process, and when over 90% of tribunals are won in parents' favour, that just reinforces to parents that all of those decision makers that are trying to get a better outcome for their children are money orientated, and it undermines that. So I think I entirely agree around the system, but the legal process must be absolutely part of endorsing that actually the system is really focused on better outcomes as opposed to financial. Thank you.
And then there was a question over here.
Thank you. Catherine Powell from Surrey County Council. I'm the leader of the Independent and RA group. I was really interested to hear you talking about curriculum and the need for change and inclusivity. But one of the things I've started to look at in where I live, which is in Farnham, is the size of schools that we now have. Academies have become larger and larger. I have to confess, I reflected on the fact that one of the schools in Farnham is 11 form entry at secondary school. And actually this year offered 375 places. And I look back at the secondary school I was at, and it was 2 form entry. That was 300 children in the entire school. And I just wonder how the academy system and the drives that the academy system has to make schools bigger and bigger works with inclusivity. Because when I sit and I talk to parents, and I do it a lot, and I recognise a lot of what you're talking about, they are worried about the size of schools. And the smallest school in Farnham today, secondary school, is 7 form entry. And because we have a lack of secondary school places, we're talking about making that 10. That will mean there is no choice of a small school for any child in my entire town. And I know that that's happening elsewhere in the country, and I just wonder how that reflects on some of the thinking you're having.
Just a slight recency bias, just given that question hangs in the air, I'm going to sort of direct individual questions to panel members, and others may want to chip in, just so we can get through as many questions as possible. James, I don't know if you want to pick up that one, size of school in relation to inclusivity.
Yeah, and I hate to deal in kind of anecdote when we talk about policy, but I have a son who's currently in year 6, and we are currently looking at secondary schools. I have to say it's very bizarre being on the other side of it, but he doesn't have special needs. He's doing fine in school, he's doing well. I'm petrified because the size of the school he's about to move to compared to the size of school he's been. I don't think it's going to come as a huge shock. And now I suspect he's probably got the tools and it's probably going to be okay for him. But I sort of start, your point is exactly right, I start thinking about, well, for children who maybe have ASD or other things, that is going to be hugely overwhelming. So I think, firstly to say, I share that concern. I suppose, when we try and get into solutions, NHT have long been a champion for small schools, so I'm all in favour of continuing to support small schools. I guess also though, if you were trying to be a bit more pragmatic, if you were running those schools, I think there's an emphasis on, well, how do you build schools within schools, frankly? How do you build parts of that school that retain that small school community feel? And there's some good stuff, some secondary schools do some really interesting stuff where they retain the kind of primary model, where for the first year in secondary school, pupils tend to stick with 1 or 2 teachers. I think there's ways that you can kind of build those communities within, and I think that's got to be what you have to do, because otherwise being one of 400 children in a year group or thousands in the school will feel overwhelming. So I think the onus is on those schools to think a bit about how do we build small communities. The building is one thing, the size of it's another thing, but how do we get that sense of nurture? Frankly, the great part of primary schooling, certainly into those early years of secondary. So I think that's where, if I was kind of running those schools, I'd be thinking.
I'm going to, unless anyone wants to add to that, I'm going to come to the next question about the legal system. Kate, I was going to sort of ask you to kick off on that one. It's a really tricky one, but I guess the question was kind of how you bring the legal system into the future of reform. When we talk about our report, we often talk about sort of 2 main pillars. So we talk about the kind of how you build inclusive capacity, but also how the statutory framework and its operation sets the right kind of conditions for equity and effective decision making. It's a controversial area, but your reflections on this.
I mean, I don't know. Are you alluding to kind of the last course, which is tribunals? Are you considering about that as well? Is that what you mean? Yeah. Well, certainly that one I think is really difficult. I will leave it to people that actually know a lot better about than me. But if you ask me what I would like to see happen and what I think the report does and what the thrust of reform should be, it should be so we're in a situation where parents in large numbers should not have to fight like crazy on tribunals and mop up a whole load of kind of wonderful kind of professional kind of help and support in that process to get what they need for their child. And if we do get the specialist help in schools, if we do get more inclusive system, then that need for constant battling, I think, hopefully will kind of not disappear, but it will go away. Not that wouldn't like to advocate that actually to take away the parents' right to have those kind of arguments. But you know, if we can get far fewer of them that feel they have to go through that process, I think then that would be a big step forward.
I'm going to just let Christine respond to that and maybe just pick off the other question about health contributions. James, I know you want to just add something to that, and then we'll come around for another round of questions. So, Christine.
Okay.
Just on big schools as well. I've seen some really big schools do really, really good things. And James is absolutely right. It's about understanding sensory needs. And it's also about being really focused on what happens at break times and what happens at lunch times and what happens outside classroom, and about helping children find their tribe. And one of the real challenges of the last government's policy on some of its push on attendance and attainment, which in itself is a good thing, meant that those kids who were socially insecure in schools dropped out of them. And so part of our role, going back to what Kate was saying earlier, is making those children happy. And that's about a real focus on sensory need and break times and friendships and making children belong. I think on the legal system, if we're looking at wholesale reform, and I think that's what we're talking about, then wholesale reform will come and the law will need to reflect that wholesale reform. But Kate's absolutely right. The issue is, how can we have got to such a mess that tribunals are the answer, when actually we've lost very, very few people understand what the graduated approach is. Ordinarily available provision, you know, we've been doing some work, we've done some really good stuff on the graduated approach, but it doesn't really strip off the tongue, does it? If you're a parent, you don't go in and say, by the way, that's what I want. So there's something about that. In terms of health, Caroline's right, this is a real struggle, and in some ways we've been able to hold health in terms of using data. So provider data has become really, really important. So we understand waiting lists, we understand how long children are waiting, but there is something fundamentally wrong in the system where currently over 200,000 children are waiting for an ASD assessment. So one of the things that our health colleagues are talking about is looking at the development of targets for community services waiting lists. Yeah? So what should it be? How long should a 3-year-old wait for a speech and language assessment? What can we build in the system that holds those really critical front-facing, school and parent-facing services to account in terms of a standard? And that, I think, is an ongoing piece of work.
James, you want to come in really quickly?
Yeah, I was going to come on Paul's question. And I feel like I'm in a very radical place in this one, and it might not be doable at all, but in a tribunal, having sat in there as a head teacher and been asked by the judge, the legal person, to kind of explain, I remember thinking, this person knows nothing about education. No criticism of that individual, but it was a very odd place to be, where you had a non-educationalist making determinations about where this child's needs would be best met. And I'm not entirely convinced that's the best way. I mean, I absolutely think parents do have the right to appeal. I think that's important. But I think we need to be a bit braver around having that much more of an education-focused conversation. I think in the report you talk about actually that National Institute for Inclusive Education having a role in kind of tribunals, where actually having to sometimes have those education experts to say, I know there's a pressure from parents, but actually taking everything around, this child's needs can be met here, or can be, because I just feel with the kind of legal, there was someone who didn't really understand education and didn't really kind of understand those child's needs. So I think trying to make those a much more education-focused conversation, and that might have to mean taking it away from legal side and bring it much more into education. How doable that is, I don't know, but I don't think we can carry on with the current system.
Again, it's a big question that we could spend more time on. I want to try and get a couple more rounds of questions. I've got 2 hands over here and a lady over here. So the gentleman at the back, and then in front, and then the question over here. If we can make them really quick, and we'll do some really quick responses.
Thank you very much to all of the panel. Really excellent presentations. Alex Dale from Derbyshire County Council, and also chair of F40, which has been doing a lot of work with Ben and Kate and others on this issue. I was really interested and agree with everything that's been said around inclusion, promoting inclusion, building confidence of parents, but it feels like it's only half the solution. There does need to be a look at what level of support the state should be providing, and whether we should be willing and agreeing to funding very expensive independent non-maintained provision. And I do think there does need to be an honest conversation with society at large around, how we can be clear around what the state will provide and what, parents can choose to pursue themselves if they want to and have the means to do that. So just interested in the panel's thoughts on that, really.
Let's get that. Question, a couple of rows in front of you.
David Hitchener, Ward Councillor from Herefordshire. I was a governor of a very small primary school, about 90 pupils. I'm very proud of the school. It deals with SEND children in a very good way, inclusive, but it tends to be a bit of a magnet for those children. So it's got more than its fair share, and as I say, I'm very proud of the way the school actually deals with them. The other side of the equation is, of course, there are schools which don't want those people. And it's all very well having a policy to say, well, you know, we want to have inclusion. How on earth in this world are you planning to actually get that to happen?
That's good. And there's a question over here.
Hi, Cam Core from Warwickshire County Council. I wanted to pick up on home education. So just at the back of the question that you've just heard about schools excluding young people, what we're seeing is now schools encouraging parents to home educate. Yeah. And actually that is a systematic problem, not just for us at Warwickshire, but right across the board. And I think I'd like to hear your views on that and how we can stop schools from, encouraging that behaviour. Thank you.
Brilliant. I might come to Alex's question first about the sort of the role of the state. Christine, do you want to have a quick go at kind of just responding to that?
I will, I'm happy to. I think we ought to be much clearer about the offer of the state. I agree. And I think that is a conversation that's grown up with parents about what's possible. That doesn't necessarily rule out the independent non-maintained sector, because I think, again, going back to our vision of inclusion and engagement, we have to be really confident that the schools that we place children in can meet their needs. If local authorities with their partners in education can meet the needs of those children, that's where they should be placed. I think there will always be a group of children who we don't meet. But you are right, much clearer. So things like transport, I know you all love homeschool transport, particularly if you're big counties. Actually, what is it we can do? What is it we can't do? What's the cost base? But we need to have the confidence to do that within a framework that supports that conversation.
Brilliant. We've got a couple of minutes left. So, James, the question about kind of more inclusive schools, less inclusive schools, that kind of non-level playing field, just in 30 seconds, how do you,
well, very quickly, I also want to just, on that last point, very, very quickly, I think there is a role for the private sector. I am deeply uncomfortable, though, with shareholders making profits, large profits off the back of children with special needs. I think we have to deal with that. Doesn't mean there's not a role for the private sector, but I think that needs looking at. On the second one, I think, we all know it happens. So I think the problem is we have a system at the moment that does not incentivise inclusion. In fact, it kind of, school leaders say to me, I feel I get punished for being inclusive because of the league table mentality, the way inspections are run, the very narrow focus on academic outcomes. Being inclusive feels like the brave thing to do. We need to flip that, so being inclusive is the natural thing to do, and I think the way we do that is we adjust the accountability measures. So Martin Oliver's talking about Ofsted having a role looking at inclusion. I'm a bit nervous about that in some ways, but I think we do need to flip the incentives to make being inclusive the obvious and easy thing to do. Yeah.
Kate, if you could pick up the question about home education, but also do comment on the other points as well.
Great, I think it comes back again to inclusion, doesn't it? And I do understand, because I've looked into this a little bit at county, and actually I understand that most children that are actually home educated do have a special education need or a disability, don't they? And clearly schools at the moment aren't meeting that need. So again, it's tackling that, isn't it, at the root cause, I think, and actually kind of making schools more inclusive. I just wanted to say as well, in terms of the market and actually kind of I do know that there is something actually in this report, which I was actually really pleased to see, to tackle this. Actually, big private companies should not be making a big profit, I don't think, out of public money and out of our children. I think it's a big thing. And as we say, there is a place for private providers. We need them. Some of them are really good. A lot of them are kind of really good. But this should not be kind of like a magnet for big organisations making an awful lot of money. And I know there is something about that in the report, isn't there, really suggesting that actually that's something that should be tackled without dismissing private and voluntary and community organisations engaging in this, because they're really important and some of them do a really good job. Okay.
I think we've got less than a minute left, so I think all I'm allowed to do in that time is thank our panellists. I'm sure you'll join me in doing so, and thank you for the questions. If there are other questions you want to grab us at the end, then obviously please do so. But thanks all, and please do continue to have this conversation about the need for reform, but also finding opportunities to combine understanding across sectors. Your schools, your parents and carers, your young people, your health colleagues, your officers, etc. Because in a sense, we want this to seem complicated and difficult, but not too hard. And there is a path through this. I think it is possible. So that would be, I think, the message I'd like to kind of take from this and draw from today. So thank you all for the time, and thank you to our panelists.
Well, that's a wrap. So, just a few sort of short housekeeping things before you disappear. First of all, can you please do the QR code for Zella, who are mapping the carbon footprint? Apparently only about 3 of you have done it so far. Slight under-exaggeration. But if you wouldn't mind doing that, would be really helpful, and you'll see the things on the doors and everywhere else. For those that are attending the closed devolution session, that will now actually start at 1:45, just to give you a little bit more time. I hope you've enjoyed the conference. I mean, I think, and please do complete the feedback survey. It's very helpful for the team to have, an understanding what we could do better, if there is anything that we could do better. So when that comes around, please fill it in. I mean, I think we've had a really wide-ranging discussion on some really important topics in terms of what's coming down the line. Funding review, multi-year settlements, devolution and the simplification of the local government structure, strategic planning, revised NPPF, reform of SCN, and a real focus on supporting working-age adults with disabilities. But for me, what we haven't really talked about in any great detail is the prevention and early intervention agenda, and early support. And that is absolutely key, I think, to addressing, increased healthy life expectancy and improved outcomes. And that, I think, is the only way that we can help both local government and indeed the NHS to manage demand. So once again, can I thank our strategic and conference partners who add real value to the work that the team do here, and to thank the team at CCN, not only for organising this conference, but also for all that they do advocating on your behalf, I can tell you, 365 days of the year. And I think we should give them a round of applause, actually. But above all, I want to thank all of you for your support and engagement with the network. Without you, it wouldn't be anything. And perhaps I can just leave you with the words of Donald J. Trump, that the CCN is a beautiful thing. Right? Have a safe journey home, and make sure you book early for next year to avoid disappointment.